Every culture leaves meaning behind in objects: a doll, a mirror, a mask, ordinary things. And yet, across centuries and continents, people keep telling the same stories about them. Stories about spirits, about identity, about transformation. The objects change, the meanings remain. Tonight's objects are dolls. There's a doll in a museum in Key West, Florida, that receives letters of apology from strangers, people who visited the museum and laughed at it, or took a photo without asking, or rolled their eyes at the sign asking for permission. They go home and things start going wrong. A car accident, a lost job, a relationship that collapses without explanation. And then a letter arrives at the museum, addressed to the doll. I'm sorry, I should have been more respectful. Please stop. The doll's name is Robert. He's about a meter tall, made in the early 1900s, dressed in a sailor suit, holding a small stuffed lion. He belonged to a boy named Robert Eugene Otto, who carried him everywhere and talked to him constantly. According to later accounts, members of the household were said to be frightened of him. Neighbors claimed to see him moving between windows when the house was empty. The boy, who grew into a man and never gave the doll away, would tell people that Robert did things. Robert was responsible. You probably know a version of this story. You've heard about haunted dolls, you've seen the horror films. But here's what the films never ask: why dolls? Of all the objects in the world, of all the things humans make and keep, why is it always dolls that become vessels for something else? Because this isn't a story that belongs to one country. Nearly every civilization has imagined that human likeness carries unusual power. Ancient Egypt buried figurines with the dead. European villages crafted puppets. Japan developed elaborate rituals for retired dolls. Across Africa, Asia, and the Americas, human shaped objects have repeatedly become places where memory, identity, and spirit seem able to settle. Different cultures arrived at remarkably similar conclusions. The coincidence deserves attention. The answer is stranger than the haunting. In 1970, a Japanese robotist named Masahiro Mori noticed something. He was studying how humans respond to robots as they become more lifelike. His hypothesis was simple: the more human a robot looks, the more we like it. But when he plotted the data, there was a dip, a valley. At a certain point, when a robot was almost human but not quite, the response didn't keep climbing. It inverted. People didn't feel more comfortable, they felt profoundly, viscerally uncomfortable. He called it the Uncanny Valley. What Mori identified was a perceptual glitch in the human brain. We are exquisitely calibrated to read human faces. We have spent hundreds of thousands of years surviving by reading of the faces of other humans, detecting illnesses, deception, detecting threats. When something looks almost human but isn't quite right, the proportions slightly off, the eyes slightly too still, the smile slightly too fixed, our threat detection system fires. Something is wrong with this person. Something is wrong with this face. Dolls sit directly in the uncanny valley. They have human features, eyes that don't move but are positioned where eyes should be, a mouth frozen in an expression, hair, proportions that approximate a human body. They are close enough to human that your brain begins the automatic process of treating them as human, and then the process fails. And when that process fails, you don't feel nothing, you feel dread. What's remarkable is how early this reaction appears. Even infants, only a few months old, are already sensitive to faces. Long before children can speak, their brains are learning the tiny movements that distinguish a living person from an object. A doll occupies that impossible category. It resembles someone, but it never quite behaves like someone. Our brains never completely stop trying to resolve that contradiction. This is a neurological explanation, but it's not the whole story. Because the uncanny valley explains why dolls feel wrong. It doesn't explain why, across dozens of completely separate cultures with no contact with each other, dolls became specifically haunted. For that, you need to understand something about how humans project soul. There is a concept in psychology called psychological essentialism. It describes the human tendency to believe that objects, particularly objects that have been in close contact with the person, absorb something of that person, something invisible, something that persists. This is not a fringe belief, it's a universal cognitive bias, documented across cultures and ages. When researchers asked people whether they would wear a cardigan that had belonged to a serial killer, if it was thoroughly cleaned and sanitized, the vast majority refused. Not because the cardigan was dangerous, because it felt contaminated by something invisible that cleaning couldn't remove. Essence, soul, whatever you want to call it. Now apply this to dolls. A doll given to a child becomes saturated with that child's essence through years of contact, care, projection. The child talks to it, cries on it, sleeps with it, tells its secrets. In many traditions, this is not metaphorical. It is understood literally. The doll absorbs the child. Developmental psychologists have a term for objects like this: transitional objects. The blanket, the stuffed animal, the doll. Objects that help children navigate the transition between dependence and independence. They become emotional storage devices, containers for comfort, fear, imagination, and identity. Which means that long before cultures began describing dolls as haunted, children had already been treating them as if they possessed inner lives. What's fascinating is that children often know these objects aren't alive, and yet they behave as though they are. They apologize to them, comfort them, give them names, hold conversations with them. Psychologists don't see this as irrational. They see it as one of the earliest ways humans practice relationships. Before we fully understand other people, we rehearse caring for them through objects. In Japan, there is a ceremony called Ningyo-kuyo. Families bring their old dolls to Buddhist temples to be ritually burnt, not thrown away, burnt with prayers, because a doll that has been loved cannot simply be discarded. The spirit inside it needs to be released properly. Otherwise, it remains trapped and unhappy. This tradition is not unusual, it is the norm. Native American traditions contain warnings about keeping the dolls of the dead. In some West African traditions, dolls are deliberately made as vessels, objects intended to house a spirit, give it form, give it a place to be. The European tradition of the puppet, the cloth figure used in folk magic, is built on the same logic. The doll is not just a symbol of person, it is the person, in a form that can be influenced. And here's where it becomes genuinely strange. Because the doll as spirit vessel tradition and the uncanny valley response don't contradict each other, they reinforce each other. The reason dolls were chosen as vessels across cultures that had no contact with each other may be precisely because of the uncanny response. The doll looks almost alive. It looks like it could be inhabited. It occupies the exact perceptual space between the animate and the inanimate, which is exactly where in every human spiritual tradition the supernatural lives. The threshold, the in between, the thing that is neither one thing or another. Dolls were always meant to be haunted. We built them that way. Perhaps that's why stories like Robert's continue to survive. Not because they prove dolls are haunted, but because they activate something our brains have been doing for thousands of years. We see faces, we imagine minds, we attach meaning. Once an object has become part of someone's emotional life, it stops feeling like an object at all. It becomes something much harder to define. Robert Eugene Otto died in 1974. He left the house and the doll to his wife. She locked Robert in the attic. She told people she could hear him moving up there. She died in 1975, reportedly terrified. The house was sold. The new family's daughter found Robert in the attic and was given him as a gift. She is reported to have woken screaming for years, insisting the doll moved in the night, that it watched her, that it wanted to hurt her. She is now an adult. She has given interviews. She maintains with complete consistency that she is telling the truth. Robert currently sits in a glass case at the Fort East Martello Museum in Key West. The museum staff will tell you that the cameras malfunction around him, that lights flicker, that the letters of apology keep arriving. Whether you believe any of that is between you and whatever you think a doll can hold. But you notice, I think, that you've been thinking about your childhood toys since I started talking, and you noticed that the thought that followed wasn't entirely comfortable. The object itself was never the point. The object was a way of talking about something larger, a fear, a belief, a part of being human that is difficult to describe directly. And that may be why these stories survive. Because long after the original meaning is forgotten, the question remains, why do humans keep seeing themselves in things? Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious.